Thank you very much, Las Ciaran Curla, and I welcome the opportunity of contributing to the second stage on this bill, which has been long awaited. From the outset, when the working group reported back in January of last year, this was identified as a key issue, the lack of data generally in insurance, and specifically the lack of data around claims and the claims process. We had certain data from the central bank's insurance statistics, the overall amount paid out by insurance firms for claims each year, but we didn't have the level of detail that we really need to challenge claims and counterclaims made by different stakeholders as to who is actually responsible for the type of hikes we have witnessed in recent years in insurance premiums. So I welcome this bill. It is well behind schedule. That has to be acknowledged. When the Oireachtas Finance Committee made the decision earlier this year not to engage in pre-legislative scrutiny, it was with a view to being helpful and in the expectation that the bill was to be published swiftly and could proceed to be brought into the House. But we are now debating second stage, and I certainly pledge my support and the support of Fianna Fáil to the passage of this legislation as quickly as possible. When the working group initially reported, the target was that this database would actually be in place on a statutory footing by the end of Q2 this year. So that was by the end of June, and that obviously didn't happen. So we're a good way behind schedule. We need to have this in place without any further delay. I note, Minister, that this database is going to focus on motor insurance claims in the first instance. I do think that the ambition should be to extend its scope as quickly as possible to other areas of insurance. But I do believe that once we get to assess the data and once the trends become clear, those trends will be equally applicable to claims from business insurance, for example. So I think the trends will become clear very quickly. And what we really need a handle on is data around the settlement channels. So we know that perhaps around 70% of claims are settled outside of PIAB and outside of court. So the vast majority of claims are not ultimately resolved either in the court system or through the Injuries Assessment Board. And so we're really in the dark then as to how it works. And not only are we in the dark, but the policyholders are very much in the dark as well when claims are made against their own insurance policy. So we need far more transparency around the data, and that, I think, is the key objective of this bill, because once we get this data published, I'm pretty sure that we will see the trends evident very quickly. I mean, we want to see a process where the Statutory Injuries Assessment Board is the reference point, that is where the majority of claims are settled. There needs to be greater certainty. The reason why we've seen such fluctuations in recent times is the fact that there isn't any certainty. And insurance companies, when they talk to you privately, will say, look, we don't want to take the risk of taking this claim into court, even though we know it might be dubious, because they're afraid of what the outcome will be. So we need greater certainty around the cost of settling individual claims. We can get a certain amount of that through reforming the work of the Injuries Board, but we also need greater consistency from the courts. And that issue is going to have to be part of the overall mix of solutions to dealing with this. The Minister has described the problem, and rightly so, and it's an enormous problem. We have the data around motor insurance premiums. We know very significant spikes and then some reduction in recent times, but still probably over 30% higher than they were before the increases started. So that has had a huge impact on younger drivers, especially many older drivers, people driving older vehicles, the ability of some people to actually get an insurance quote, and the general motoring population, all impacted in a very serious way by that trend. What we don't have a handle on, because we don't have any central bank data, is around the cost of business insurance. So employer liability, public liability, no data whatsoever from the CSO in relation to that. But we do know from the feedback we're getting from individual businesses, from the representative bodies, that there's a real problem there too. A real problem around the level of hikes, not just in the premium, but also changes to the nature of the policy. You know, the level of excess being increased, more and more exclusions being provided for within the policy. So not only the price of insurance, but the quality and the coverage of the insurance policy has diminished, and that can be an equally important aspect for businesses that, you know, might now be facing an excess of €15,000 for any individual claim, and they're questioning the value of paying insurance. And the reality is, a number of them, and I would suspect a growing number of businesses, are now effectively self-insuring. They're taking the risk. They're not paying insurance because they will say, what's the point of doing so? Of course, you know, that is not a road we want businesses to go down. Obviously, it's a legal requirement that motorists have to have insurance. Businesses, you know, if they have loans and so on, will be required to have insurance in place. But many of them are taking the risk of operating without insurance, and it's not a trend that we want to see developing, because they're exposing themselves to enormous risk, and their business, and indeed their family, and their home. Potentially everything could be on the line if there isn't limited liability and there isn't an insurance policy in place. That's something that I think we have to reiterate that message. I think the key section of the bill really is section 8, subsection 4, which details out the specific information which is going to be gathered now in this database. And the Minister went through some of it, about the costs, the expenditures, the number of claims, the nature of the claims, and then information about the various settlement channels. Are they settling outside of court, as we know they are in a lot of cases? To what extent is the final settlement as a result of a court award, and to what extent is it as a result of a decision by the Injuries Board? And what are the costs associated with these claims? You know, we have seen a lot of debates between Insurance Ireland, the legal profession, other stakeholders, all blaming each other for rising costs. So we need the data. You know, that will really call out some of the assertions that have been made in the last number of years when we have been engaged in this debate around why insurance premiums have been going where they have been going. What we really have to get a handle on is information around pricing. How do insurance companies arrive at a certain price, at a certain premium, which they're quoting to, in this case, the motorist principally? And if we can get a handle on the claims issue, I think we'll go a long way there. It's not the only issue. There are many other issues involved. The reality is insurance companies have suffered from very poor investment returns over the last number of years, and so they've placed a large burden then on claims and on premiums for getting a return that they need and for generating a profit. So that has to be acknowledged as well, and they need to get their own house in order in dealing with this problem. Minister, one issue that you mentioned or it's actually in the bill itself, is section 11 about the expenses and the costs involved in establishing and administering the database, and there is reference to a levy on the industry, so that the central bank recoups the costs it's incurring. You make reference to ECB monetary financing, and you can't contravene that, but I think you need to hear the message loud and clear. Consumers have had enough levies in relation to insurance. You might say this is a levy on the industry, but we all know what happens when the industry is levied. That levy and the cost of that levy is automatically added to policies and premiums. So when you are doing the RAP, it's something you you might clarify, what are the expected costs involved in establishing and administering this database? Will all of those costs have to be recouped from the industry? If so, how and when? Will that be in the form of a levy? And then, you can't give any assurance whatsoever that those costs are not going to be passed on directly to the policyholders. So the whole objective here is to apply downward pressure on premiums by getting more transparency, more data, more information about the claims environment. So we don't want it to have the opposite effect in any way, indirectly, which I know is not the intention, but I think it's an important issue that you should address. I welcome your comments at the end of your speech about the Civil Liability and Courts Act 2004 and the amendments you intend to bring forward. So we haven't seen those amendments yet, but I understand the issue that you're seeking to tackle there is really the discrepancy at the moment between the length of time that a business can retain CCTV footage, which I think typically is a month, and the period within which a person can lodge a personal injury claim and notify the business that they are making a claim. And we've heard story after story of businesses who have wiped, as they're required to do in accordance with the law, the CCTV footage, and some months later, and perhaps on the eve of the deadline, they are informed of a personal injury claim, and the evidence is gone. The evidence is gone, and the evidence may well have been such to prove that the claim is without foundation, whether it be completely bogus, exaggerated, or just downright fraudulent. And I think we're going to have to find some alignment between those issues, because it's completely unreasonable that businesses are not allowed to retain the CCTV, and then there's a further period within which people can make claims and you cannot defend yourself. And so you need to align those issues, Minister, in the best way that you can, in a manner, of course, that's constitutional and that protects the independence of the courts, and we all understand that, but that issue is a key issue which has to be dealt with. So in terms of the passage of this legislation, we won't be found wanting within Fianna Fáil. We are going to support this legislation. We will consider bringing forward certain amendments, but I think now that we have the actual bill that's before us, we need to move swiftly to get it enacted and to get the operational provisions in place so that this database can be established, up and running, and can start within a short period of time making data available. There are so many other strands to the whole insurance debate, Minister, and all of the other recommendations from the working group on motor insurance, and then the employer and public liability report as well, the whole issue of tackling insurance fraud, and a lot of people would have seen the recent primetime investigation as such, and there are so many issues there that need to be dealt with, and we need to get to a point where people will not take the risk of lodging a bogus claim or an exaggerated claim, because there will be consequences for doing so. And we're too soft in this country in the way we deal with such issues. There should be a very serious penalty, and we need to see cases brought to court where there is clear evidence that claims are fraudulent, are without foundation, or are exaggerated. People need to be held to account for that, and there needs to be penalties actually imposed. I know all of that is not directly within your control, but it is a key factor. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't fully, and I would never suggest it goes all the way to explaining the increases we've seen in insurance in recent times, but I think it is certainly a factor. But the overall message, I think, around claims and the claims environment is we need to move to a position where there is greater certainty as to what the outcome is going to be. If there is greater certainty as to what the outcome is going to be, and there is less fluctuation, then there will be less incentive to delay. There will be less incentive to go to court. There will be less incentive to engage in adversarial legal proceedings. There will be less incentive to incur huge legal costs if the outcome can be predicted with reasonable certainty for the claim. So that, to me, is where the ultimate destination is. The National Claims Information Database is a vehicle that hopefully will help us to get to that point, because once we have the data, we can assess many of the assertions that have been made over the last number of years. So I pledge the support of our party in dealing with this issue. We will seek to improve the bill as necessary over the period ahead, but I want you, Minister, to use the mandate from this House once this bill is enacted to get it up and running and in place without any further delay. There is huge support across this House for tackling the issue of insurance costs, which is affecting so many motorists, businesses around the country, community, voluntary, sporting bodies. There's hardly an event now that arises where the question of insurance is not centre stage, and that's because of the claims environment that has been created. So it needs to be dealt with, and this database is a vital step in tackling that issue by the provision of accurate and reliable information which is coming from the industry but is ultimately validated and is on a statutory basis. Thank you, Laskin Corley.